She was just a nurse. That's what they told her, every single day. Just a nurse. Stay back. You don't belong here. Police Sergeant Derek Wolfe looked at Madeline Hayes and saw exactly what he wanted to see. A quiet woman in scrubs, soft-voiced and out of place. He shoved her aside at crime scenes, mocked her in crowded trauma bays, threatened to have her removed from emergencies she was the only one qualified to handle. Nobody pushed back. Nobody explained what was buried beneath her calm expression, beneath that scratched watch on her left wrist, beneath years of deliberate silence. Nobody told Derek Wolfe that the woman he was humiliating had carried dying soldiers out of places he'd never been cleared to enter. Nobody warned him. And that was his first mistake. If this story already has you hooked, follow along until the very end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Let's go. Northgate Medical Center sat at the edge of Ashford like a building that had never quite settled into itself. Too large for the neighborhood surrounding it, too underfunded for the emergencies it kept receiving, its emergency bay permanently carrying the smell of exhaust and old concrete and whatever the winter had most recently dragged in off the streets. The ER ran short-staffed on a good night. On a bad night, it ran on institutional habit and whoever was still on their feet by hour 10. Madeline Hayes was always still on her feet. She wasn't memorable in the way people expected nurses to be memorable. She didn't ease tension with humor or pull frightened patients back from panic with warm words. She worked with a precision that registered on most people as distance, and she moved through a trauma bay the way water moves through a narrow pipe, efficiently, quietly, shaped by the space rather than fighting it. 37 years old. Brown hair pulled back tight enough that it looked almost severe. No jewelry except a scratched analog watch on her left wrist that everyone had noticed and nobody had ever asked about. Her file at Northgate listed prior military service under field medical. The details were buried under a classification code that the hospital's HR system had flagged once 4 years ago when she was first hired, and then quietly moved past because nobody in Ashford Regional Administration had the clearance to request further disclosure and nobody had thought hard enough about it to try. She preferred it that way. The night Derek Wolfe first walked into her ER, she was elbow deep in a man with a lacerated femoral artery, her gloved hands moving with the kind of calm that only comes from having done this in conditions that made a fluorescent-lit trauma bay feel almost restful. 2 newer nurses flanked her, one of them visibly fighting to keep her breathing steady. The monitors were alarming. Someone across the bay was calling for a second IV line. The overhead light had been flickering for 3 months because maintenance kept deprioritizing the work order. Wolfe came through the bay doors like he owned the building. He was a large man, broad shoulders, a sergeant's posture that had somewhere along the way curdled from authority into expectation. 3 officers behind him, all of them reading the room with the cautious deference of people who'd learned not to get in front of whatever Wolfe was moving toward. "I need a medic. One of my officers took a hit to the forearm. I need him cleared to go back on scene." Madeline didn't look up. "Someone will be with him in 4 minutes?" "I'm not waiting 4 minutes. That's how long this is going to take." She checked the pulse distal to the wound, held pressure, kept moving. "Triage nurse is at the front desk." Wolfe looked at her the way certain men look at women who haven't immediately accommodated them. A slow, recalibrating survey that started as inconvenience and sharpened into something more deliberate. He stepped forward. "You know who I am?" "Sergeant Wolfe, you've been through here twice before." She glanced at him just briefly. "Your officer is stable. Through and through to the lateral deltoid. He's not losing the arm. He's not bleeding out." 4 minutes. Something moved across Wolfe's face. Not embarrassment, something tighter than that. "Just do your job," he said, and turned away. She did. She always did. The second encounter happened 3 weeks later, on a domestic call in the Millvale corridor that went sideways when the responding officers found the homeowner unconscious on his kitchen floor, cardiac arrest, no pulse. 2 police units were already there when Madeline drove past on her way home from a double shift. Saw the clustered cruisers, the open front door, the particular energy of people trying to look calm while something was going wrong. She pulled over without planning to. It was reflex, the kind that doesn't consult the rational part of your brain first. She had a field kit in her trunk, not the standard hospital issue, something she'd assembled herself over years, contents that reflected a level of field experience her hospital badge didn't explain. She was through the front door before the perimeter officers had fully registered what was happening. Wolfe was already inside. The paramedics were 90 seconds out. The officer performing compressions was losing his rhythm. Too fast. Shallow. Adrenaline doing what adrenaline does when training starts slipping. Madeline clocked it before she fully crossed the room. She knelt beside him, corrected his hand placement without asking, said a verbal 2 count that the officer locked onto without realizing he'd adjusted. "Who let her in?" Wolfe, from somewhere behind her. She came in through... Get her out." "Sergeant, look at his color." "Out." Madeline kept working. The man's chest was moving correctly now, rhythm holding. She had 2 fingers on his carotid and was counting. A younger officer put a hand on her shoulder. Not rough, just present. "Ma'am, you need to step back." She looked at the officer doing compressions and held his eyes. "Keep that pace exactly. Don't speed up when the medics come in. Tell them anterior STEMI suspected. He needs a 12 lead the second they have him loaded." Then she stood, picked up her kit, and walked out. The paramedics passed her in the doorway. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and listened to them work. And when she heard one of them relay possible anterior STEMI, getting a cath lab on the line, she got in her car and drove the rest of the way home. The formal complaint from Wolfe arrived at Northgate's administration the following morning. Unauthorized intrusion into an active police scene, interference with established emergency protocol. The administrator who called her in, a careful man named Bertram, who favored euphemisms over direct statements, adjusted his glasses twice before speaking. He's using the word contaminated. "The patient lived," Madeline said. "That's not the point he's making." "What point is he making?" Bertram looked at his desk. "That you undermined scene command." She looked at him quietly for a moment. The clock ticked. Bertram had the expression of a man who'd absorbed so much friction over the years that he'd stopped being able to distinguish between friction and injustice. "Is there formal action against me?" "Not at this time." "Then I'll be on the floor." She was. The construction collapse happened on a Tuesday. Nobody who was in Ashford that day ever fully explained why the ordinariness of the weekday made it worse. Something about the mundanity of the hour, 2:09 in the afternoon, the kind of time when people are eating lunch at their desks or stuck in meetings or waiting for the afternoon to turn into something else. The Harmon Tower project had been running 8 months behind schedule. Budget pressure had become corner-cutting, which had become deferred inspections, which would eventually become a criminal investigation. But that was afterward. Now was the sound, a low sequential groan that residents 3 blocks away described as the building pulling a breath before everything let go. 4 stories of scaffolding and partial concrete structure came down in less than 6 seconds. 11 workers on site. 2 had stepped away for a break. The other 9 were inside the collapse radius. Northgate received the mass casualty alert at 2:17. By 2:23, every available unit in the county was being redirected. Madeline was dispatched as part of the hospital's field medical response, alongside 2 EMTs and Dr. Carver Osman, a trauma physician who hadn't run a field call in 4 years and was working very hard not to let that show. The site was chaos with debris on top of it, dust still hanging in the air, firefighters coordinating extraction from 2 points, police running perimeter. And inside the settling rubble, people making sounds. Wolfe was on perimeter command. He saw her before she'd cleared the outer tape. Hospital staff stages at the secondary line. "We were dispatched as secondary line." He pointed 30 meters back. "You receive patients as they're brought out. That's the arrangement." Osmond stepped up beside her. "Sergeant, the mass casualty protocol specifically designates field medical." "I know what it designates. Secondary line." Wolfe held the point with the particular immovability of a man who'd decided this was about more than logistics. "Move." Madeline stood still for a half-second, scanning past him into the site. 2 things registered. First, a firefighter at the eastern pocket was braced with one arm against a concrete slab, weight locked, the stillness of someone holding something in place rather than just working near it. Second, The north extraction team was working directly beneath a partial ceiling section with a diagonal shear fracture running across its base, visible from here if you knew what you were looking at. She turned to Osman and said, low and flat, "North ceiling section above their extraction team. Shear fracture, diagonal, running from the upper left. Tell Fire Command to move their anchor point. Tell them now." Osman looked. His face changed. He went. Madeline moved west along the perimeter, found the section where the tape had gone slack around a parked support vehicle, and slipped through while Wolfe was turned toward a radio call. She walked fast across open ground toward the eastern pocket. The firefighter bracing the slab was a woman in her late 30s, and when she looked up at Madeline, the expression on her face was past questions. "How many underneath?" Madeline was already crouching, reading the geometry of the debris. "2. One responsive, one not. The responsive one, something's wrong with his breathing. One side isn't moving right." Her arms were shaking slightly with the effort of holding. "I can't hold this much longer." "You won't need to." Madeline was pulling on gloves, reading the gap at the slab's lower edge. "The responsive one, is he grabbing at his chest?" Yeah, he keeps doing that." Tension pneumothorax, the compressed space, the mechanism of injury, the asymmetric breathing. She filed it. "When you feel the weight shift, don't compensate. Let it settle. If you try to correct it, you lose your footing." "What are you doing?" "Keeping them alive." She found the entry gap. "Barely enough. Enough." "What's your name?" "Perez." "Lucia." "Lucia, keep holding." She went in sideways, Kit first, and the outside world closed down to dust and low sound, and the smell of ruptured pipe, and the particular quality of air inside a place that has just compressed itself violently around the people who were inside it. The responsive worker was a man in his 40s, construction dust packed into every line of his face, one hand pressed flat against his own sternum, as if he could physically hold his lung in place. He looked at her with the focused desperation of someone who has decided that whoever just appeared is the last thing they're going to trust. "I'm a nurse. I'm here." She kept her voice level, already moving her hands to his chest. "What's your name?" "Tomas." Each word was work. "Tomas Reyes." "Tomas, I'm going to touch your chest. Tell me if anything changes." She palpated. He flinched sharply at the left anterior. She went still for a moment, listening, absent breath sounds on the right. She found his trachea and felt the deviation, subtle but unmistakable, the classic presentation of a tension pneumothorax building toward the point where the heart would run out of room and everything would simply stop. She had a needle decompression kit in her bag. She'd added it herself 2 years ago, after watching a man die on a highway median while waiting 40 seconds for an ALS unit that arrived 41 seconds too late. The hospital's field kit didn't carry one. Nobody had ever looked closely enough at her bag to notice what she'd added. "This is going to hurt for 1 second, she told him. "Is it going to work?" "Yes." He held her eyes. She found the landmark, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, cleaned the site, and placed the needle. The sound was small and definitive in the enclosed space. Tomas pulled in a breath, deep, full, both sides of his chest moving together for the first time in however long he'd been trapped here, and his hand dropped away from his sternum. "There," she said. He said something under his breath that wasn't quite words. His color was already changing. She turned to the second victim, unconscious, breathing, shallow but present. Pulse at the carotid, weak and irregular, but there. Head injury. The way his upper body was positioned against the fallen beam suggested potential spinal involvement. She was not moving him. She put 2 fingers on his wrist, monitored for 30 seconds, and when the pulse stayed consistent, she repacked her kit and began working her way back toward the gap. Wolfe was waiting outside. He was 3 feet from the opening when she emerged into the gray afternoon, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man whose authority had been publicly circumvented twice in the same afternoon by the same person and who had decided this was going to stop. "You entered an active collapse zone without clearance." Tomas Reyes had a tension pneumothorax. He had approximately 3 to 4 minutes before cardiac tamponade. It's been addressed. She stripped off her gloves. The second victim has suspected spinal involvement. Do not move him without a full rigid board and collar. Tell the extraction team not to use the flexible stretcher they're currently staging. And the eastern slab is going to shift in the next 15 to 20 minutes, so your window for getting them out is closing. Wolfe stepped into her path. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, and he used the height the way men sometimes did, as punctuation for a point they were already making with their voice. I don't know what you think your role is on this scene. Right now, my role is telling you that 2 men need to come out of that pocket in the next 12 minutes. She didn't step back. Everything else can happen later. She moved around him and walked toward the staging area. She heard him behind her, not following, just standing there, the particular quality of stillness that means someone has made a decision about you and is taking their time deciding when to act on it. By evening, both workers were in surgery. Tomas Reyes was listed as stable. Paul Drebin, the second victim, spinal injury, was out of immediate danger, his neurological function intact, attributed in part to correct immobilization protocol relayed from inside the collapse pocket. The North Extraction Team's repositioning, which had happened approximately 4 minutes before that ceiling section dropped, had kept 3 firefighters from being buried under it. Wolfe's incident report reached Northgate administration by 7 p.m. Unauthorized entry into a collapse zone. Refusal to comply with scene command authority. Administration of an advanced field procedure outside the defined scope of hospital nursing practice. Patricia Vance, the chief nursing officer, 22 years at Northgate, a woman who communicated in complete sentences without softening agents, called Madeline directly rather than routing through Bertram. The compliance office is going to want a meeting tomorrow. Wolfe's report is going to require a formal response. I know. The needle decompression is going to be the sticking point, scope of practice, the kit contents. I know. A pause on the line. Is there anything in your background that gives us ground to stand on here? Anything at all? Madeline was at her kitchen table, still in her scrubs. A cup of tea in front of her that she hadn't touched. The window was dark and her reflection looked back at her from the glass. A quiet woman, tired around the eyes, nothing about her that would make anyone look twice. Not anything I can put on paper, she said. Another pause. Get some sleep. She finished the call. She sat for a while looking at the window. Then she drank the tea cold, went to bed, and slept without difficulty. Efficiently, without ceremony, the way she'd learned to sleep in places where you took the rest when it was available because there was no guarantee it would be available later. She didn't know, in that moment, what the next morning was already moving toward. She didn't know that a secondary section of the Harmon site, re-entered by an overnight stabilization crew, had partially shifted at 4 a.m., opening a void that a search dog located at 6:30. She didn't know that the man pulled out of that void at 9:47 in the morning had been an auxiliary consultant on the project who hadn't been on the original head count. She didn't know his face. She thought she didn't know his face. But when they brought him through the ER doors at Northgate at 10:02, gray-skinned, barely conscious, a trauma caller already on from the field, and when the attending physician called for the nearest available nurse, and Madeline stepped to the bedside with a pen light, and when she leaned over him to assess pupillary response, and the light caught her face at that particular angle, the man's eyes opened. They were dark and exhausted, and they found her face with a focus that was startling in someone that close to the edge of consciousness. His lips moved. She leaned in. His voice was barely a sound, barely 4 words. I know you. You were there. The room kept moving around her. Monitors, voices, the rhythm of emergency. But something in Madeline Hayes went very still. The kind of still that isn't calm. The kind that happens when the past reaches through 6 years of deliberate distance and closes its hand around something you'd convinced yourself was buried deep enough to stay that way. Wolfe was standing 10 feet away watching her face. And for the first time all day, for the first time in longer than that, Madeline Hayes did not look like someone who had everything under control. The man's name came back to her in pieces. Not the name he'd been using on the Harmon site, not whatever identity he was carrying now. The name she'd known him by 6 years ago, in a place that didn't have a name on any map she'd ever been allowed to keep. Sergeant First Class Rourke. Victor Rourke. She'd held his left arm together with her bare hands for 11 minutes while the evacuation bird was rerouted twice, and she'd told him, she remembered this clearly, absurdly clearly, that if he moved that arm, she would personally ensure his medical discharge paperwork listed the cause as terminal stupidity. He'd laughed, bleeding out, in the dark, in the noise, and he'd laughed. She remembered that. She didn't move, didn't speak. The ER kept running around her. Dr. Osman was calling for a CT order. A nurse was cutting away the man's outer layer. Someone had found a secondary laceration on his scalp and was calling out the measurements. And Madeline stood at the bedside with the penlight still in her hand and looked at Victor Rourke's face and felt 6 years of careful distance compress into about 3 seconds. "You know this patient?" Osman was watching her. "No." The word came out flat and immediate. Checking pupillary response. She checked it. Left pupil, normal. Right pupil, sluggish. Consistent with the head injury, not necessarily indicating bleed. She relayed it to Osman in the clipped shorthand of someone who has returned to function and intends to stay there. Wolfe hadn't moved from his position near the wall. She could feel him watching her the way you feel weather before it arrives. A pressure change. A quality of attention that had texture to it. He'd seen her face in that first moment before she'd corrected it. She knew that. She also knew there was nothing in that moment she could explain to him, and that explaining it would require disclosures she had neither the authorization nor the inclination to make. She finished her assessment, reported to Osman, and stepped back from the bay. Wolfe intercepted her before she cleared the doorway. "You recognized him." "I assessed him. That's my job." "That's not what your face said." She looked at him directly. "I've been on shift for 9 hours, Sergeant. My face says a lot of things that aren't relevant." He held the eye contact for a beat longer than necessary. "I'm filing a formal request for your personnel record with hospital administration." "That's your right." She moved past him. "I have 3 other patients." She did. She went to them. She did her job with the same precision she always did, and if her hands weren't entirely steady for the first 20 minutes after she left that trauma bay, she kept them busy enough that nobody noticed. Victor Rourke went to CT. The scan came back with a moderate concussion, a hairline fracture to the left orbital ridge, and nothing that required immediate surgical intervention. He was moved to a monitored room on the 2nd floor. Stable. Sedated for pain management, Madeline didn't go back to see him. She told herself it was because she had a full patient load, and this was true. She told herself it was because there was nothing medically actionable about what he'd said to her, and this was also true, technically. She stayed away because she wasn't ready to open whatever door that 4-word sentence was standing in front of. Not here, not today. Not in a hospital where Derek Wolfe was currently 2 floors below, filing paperwork and building a case against her like a man with nothing better to do than dismantle someone he'd decided was in his way. The compliance meeting with Patricia Vance and a hospital attorney named Raymond Salk happened at noon in the 4th floor conference room with the window that looked out over the parking structure. Salk had the Wolfe incident report in front of him. He was methodical and unenthusiastic about his situation. The needle decompression procedure is the central issue. That falls outside the defined scope of an RN under state licensing guidelines, unless performed under direct physician authorization or in a documented life-threatening situation where advanced personnel are unavailable. Both conditions were met, Madeline said. You'll need documentation. The patient was in a collapse void. There was no physician present. The documented outcome, tension pneumothorax resolved, patient stabilized, confirmed by ER attending on arrival, speaks to the necessity. Oh, the documentation will speak to necessity after the fact. What Sergeant Wolfe's report establishes is that you entered a scene without authorization, performed a procedure without direct supervision, and did so after being explicitly directed to stay at the secondary staging line. Salk looked at her over his reading glasses. Do you understand what that gives him to work with? I understand what it gives him to work with. I also understand that Tomas Reyes is alive. Vance, who had been quiet until now, set her coffee cup down with a small, deliberate sound. Raymond, the second outcomes at the ceiling section the firefighters cleared before it dropped. Walk me through the liability exposure there. Salk glanced at his notes. Ms. Hayes relayed structural observation to Dr. Osman, who relayed it to Fire Command. The repositioning happened approximately 4 minutes prior to the section's collapse. 3 firefighters were in the affected area at the time of the relay. He paused. Had they not moved, and had the section dropped with personnel underneath? 3 firefighters, Vance said. Potentially, yes. So we have 1 patient whose life was saved by direct intervention and 3 first responders whose lives were potentially saved by her structural observation. Vance looked at Madeline. Wolfe's report doesn't mention the ceiling. It doesn't, Salk confirmed. Pull Dr. Osman's report. I want it attached to every copy of the Wolfe complaint before it goes anywhere. Salk made a note. He didn't look comfortable, but he was a professional, and he adjusted. Even so, Ms. Hayes, the scope of practice question is going to follow you. If Sergeant Wolfe escalates this to the state licensing board, let him escalate it. Madeline said it without heat. If the board wants to review the case, they'll see what I did and why I did it. I'm not interested in protecting my license at the expense of a patient who was 4 minutes from dying. The room was quiet. Vance looked at her with an expression that was not entirely readable, something between frustration and something else, something that sat closer to respect and was trying not to show itself too obviously. You're not making this easy to defend. I know. Is there anything, and I mean anything, in your background that would reframe the scope of practice argument? Prior certifications, advanced training, anything that expands your authorized procedural range? Madeline looked at the window, at the gray parking structure and the flat Ashford sky above it. There might be, she said, but it's not something I can disclose unilaterally. Vance and Salk exchanged a look. What does that mean exactly? Salk asked. It means the documentation exists. It means accessing it would require a specific request through a specific channel that I'm not in a position to initiate myself. She turned back from the window. If it becomes necessary, there are people who can verify my qualifications, but that's a door I'd prefer not to open unless it's the only one left. Another silence. Longer. All right, Vance said finally. For now, we respond to Wolfe's complaint through standard channels. Raymond documents the medical outcomes. We request a 10-day extension before any formal action is taken. She looked at Madeline. In the meantime, you stay in the building, no field response. If there's another call, you're not on the dispatch list. Madeline nodded. She didn't argue. Arguing would have been easier, but she understood the position Vance was in, and she understood that Vance was trying to protect her in the way that a 22-year nursing administrator knew how to protect someone, through procedure and documentation and bought time, which were real tools even if they weren't the ones Madeline was built to use. She went back to the floor. She did her job. At 3:47 in the afternoon, Victor Rourke pulled out his IV. The floor nurse found him sitting upright in the bed, IV cannula dripping onto the sheet, and called for assistance with the particular tone that meant the patient is conscious and uncooperative and I need backup. Madeline was the closest person with a free pair of hands. She came through the doorway and stopped. He looked worse in proper light than he had in the trauma bay. The orbital fracture had blossomed into a bruise that covered the left side of his face in shades of purple and yellow, and he'd lost weight since she'd last seen him. Not sick weight, the lean kind, the kind that comes from years of field work and not thinking much about regular meals. But his eyes were clear. Whatever the sedation had been doing, he'd burned through enough of it to be fully present in the room. He looked at her. She looked at him. The floor nurse, who was 24 and had not trained for whatever was happening in the air between these two people, said, Sir, you need to let us reinsert the IV, the doctor ordered. Give us a minute, Rourke said. His voice was rough from the tube they'd placed in transit, but it had the same quality she remembered, the kind of quiet that meant he was used to being listened to. Sir, I can't. 1 minute. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Madeline stepped fully into the room. I've got it, Jessie. Thank you. The floor nurse hesitated, then left. Madeline moved to the bedside and picked up the IV line with the practiced efficiency of someone who is doing something with her hands, specifically so she doesn't have to immediately do anything with her face. Hold still. You said you didn't know me. He was watching her work on the cannula. Down there. You told the doctor you didn't know me. You were barely conscious. I was conscious enough. A pause. You haven't changed. You have. She reinserted the IV, secured the tape, checked the drip. You've got a moderate concussion and a fracture behind your eye socket. Stop pulling things out. Madeline. It was the first time anyone had used her first name all day. She didn't know why that landed the way it did. Something about the specific weight he put on it, the way it contained everything he wasn't saying yet. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. How long have you been in Ashford? She asked. 8 months. Site consultant, structural advisory. It's a cover mostly. There's a DoD contract, a monitoring project, nothing I can get into. He shifted against the pillow and winced. How long have you been here? 4 years? Anyone know? No. He nodded like this made complete sense, because it did. She watched him process something, the way he always had. Not visibly, just a quiet internal adjustment, the same way the best operators she'd known processed information, without drama. The cop, he said. The big one. He was watching you when I came in. Wolfe, he's been a problem. How bad? She gave him the short version. The domestic call, the construction site, the compliance meeting, the formal complaint. She kept it brief and sequential, the same way she'd have briefed a situation to a superior in another life. Rourke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He has no idea. No. And you want to keep it that way. For now. She looked at him. I'd appreciate it if you kept it that way too. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The particular expression of someone who finds a situation simultaneously impossible and entirely consistent with everything they know about the person in front of them. You saved my arm. In the Corda Valley, you held the ulnar artery together for 11 minutes while Ramirez was getting the bird rerouted. I remember. You told me if I moved, you'd put me on medical discharge for terminal stupidity. I remember that too. I didn't move. No, you didn't. She stood. You need to sleep. The concussion protocol requires... Madeline. His voice stopped her at the door. Whatever's coming with that cop, don't fold. I've seen you work. I've seen you work in conditions that would have broken people with 3 times your training. Whatever he thinks he knows about you, it's a fraction of what's actually there. She stood with her hand on the doorframe. I know, she said. She left him there. She walked back to the floor. She checked on her patients, updated her charts, caught a 20-minute break around 6 where she sat in the break room and drank terrible coffee and stared at the wall. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed with a message from an internal Northgate number she didn't recognize. Ms. Hayes. This is Raymond Salk. Sergeant Wolfe has made a direct inquiry to the State Nursing Board regarding your licensure. He's also requested a formal review of your personnel file through the police department's legal liaison. I'd like to meet tomorrow morning before your shift. 7 a.m. if possible. She read it twice. Put the phone down. The coffee was bad. She finished it anyway. She was back on the floor by 6:30, covering the last hour of the evening shift because one of the overnight nurses had called out sick. It was the kind of detail that barely registered on a normal night. Except this was not a normal night. And at 8:47 p.m., the radio at the nurses' station crackled with a police dispatch frequency that someone had left open. And the words that came through it rearranged the next several hours of Madeline Hayes' life without asking her permission. All units, active shooter reported at the intersection of Callaway and 9th. Multiple officers down, hot zone established. EMS holding at outer perimeter. Repeat, multiple officers down. EMS is not authorized to enter. The nurses' station went quiet. Madeline stood very still. Callaway and 9th was 4 blocks from Northgate. The ER would start receiving within minutes. Whoever was alive and extractable, whoever the perimeter teams could get to without taking fire themselves. But multiple officers down in a hot zone meant people bleeding inside a line that medical personnel couldn't legally cross. She was already thinking about what she had in her kit. She was already thinking about a lot of things. Patricia Vance appeared in the hallway with her coat on, heading toward the ER bay to prepare for incoming. She saw Madeline's face and stopped walking. "No," Vance said. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." Vance stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You are not on the dispatch list. You are currently under a compliance review. If you go out that door toward an active shooter scene, Derek Wolfe will have exactly what he needs to pull your license, and there will be nothing I can do to stop it." Madeline looked down the hallway, then at Vance. "How many officers down?" she asked. Vance's jaw tightened. "Dispatch said multiple. They're not releasing a number. An EMS is holding at the perimeter. That's the protocol for a hot zone." "I know it's the protocol." She held Vance's eyes. "How long before tactical clears the scene?" "Could be 20 minutes, could be an hour. You know how these things, 20 minutes is a long time to bleed." Vance stared at her. There was something happening in her expression that went past frustration, past institutional caution, into something more complicated. The look of a woman who understood exactly what was being said to her and understood exactly what saying no would mean and was trying to find a way to live inside that knowledge. "Madeline." Her voice was different now, quieter. "I can't authorize this." "I know you can't." A long beat. "Your kit is in your locker," Vance said. "I'm going to the ER bay to prep for incoming." She paused. "I'll be there for at least the next 40 minutes. She walked away. Madeline stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the locker room, moving with the same unhurried purpose she always moved with, neither fast enough to alarm anyone nor slow enough to waste the time she didn't have. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone buzzed again. Not a text. A call. Unknown number. She picked it up. Silence for 1 second. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 6 years. Different from Rourke's. Higher. Clipped. With a precise quality that she associated with a very specific tier of military communication. "Captain Hayes." The rank hit her like a physical thing. She hadn't heard it since she'd signed the discharge papers. "This is a civilian number," she said. "We're aware. We have personnel in the Callaway area. We need to know your current status and proximity." She stood very still in the locker room with her kit on the floor and the phone pressed to her ear. 4 blocks, she said. Copy. Do not engage until..." She hung up. She picked up her kit. She walked out of the locker room, down the service corridor, and out through the side entrance that opened onto the street running parallel to Northgate's east wall. The sound of gunfire was already audible from 4 blocks away. Not continuous, but present, sporadic bursts that told her the situation was still active and still chaotic, and that somewhere between here and the intersection of Callaway and 9th, police officers were lying on the ground running out of time. She started walking. Then she started running. The gunfire got louder at the end of the 2nd block. Not the movie kind of loud. Not the clean, sharp cracks that sound like punctuation. This was the real kind. The kind that has texture and echo and arrives in your chest before your ears fully process it. The kind Madeline's nervous system recognized before her conscious mind caught up. Her body adjusted without being asked. Shoulders dropped. Breathing slowed. Her stride shifted from a run into something lower and more deliberate, using the parked cars along the east side of the street as natural cover without thinking about it as a tactical decision. It simply was one. The way breathing was a decision her body made without consulting her. She reached the outer perimeter at Callaway and 7th. 2 patrol officers were holding the tape line, both of them young, both of them vibrating with the particular frequency of people who are supposed to be in control of a situation that is very clearly not controlled. "Ma'am, stop." Northgate Medical, field response. She didn't slow until she was at the tape itself. "How many officers down inside the hot zone?" "You can't be here." "How many?" The younger of the 2, a kid, genuinely 22 at most, with the look of someone who'd been on the job for maybe 8 months, said, 3 confirmed, maybe 4. Shooters in the Callaway parking structure, 2nd level. Tactical is still establishing. Where are the 3? 2 are down near the southeast corner of the structure entrance. 1 is, we don't know exactly, somewhere mid-block. There was a secondary exchange. Is anyone in there with them? EMS can't enter until tactical clears. I know the protocol. She looked at the tape, at the street beyond it. at the structure entrance 300 meters away, visible between two buses that had been abandoned when the situation started. What's the shooter's pattern? Is he moving or holding? The older officer, still young, maybe 28, with a sergeant's stripe he'd probably had for less than a year, stepped forward. Lady, I can't let you pass this line. If something happens to you in there, if something happens to those officers in there because nobody went in, that's going to be a different conversation. She met his eyes. I'm not asking your permission. I'm asking for information so I can do this more efficiently. A burst of radio traffic crackled from both their vests. Something about the secondary shooter position being reevaluated. The older officer pressed his earpiece, listening, and his face told her the update was not an improvement. She went under the tape. Neither of them stopped her. She'd read it right. They were good people in an impossible position, and sometimes good people in impossible positions need someone to make a decision so they don't have to carry it themselves. The street between the perimeter and the structure entrance was not empty. There were two civilian vehicles stopped at angles that told a story of sudden braking, both doors on the driver's side hanging open, a food cart on its side, a traffic signal cycling green to yellow to red for nobody. The sound of the shooter was coming from above and to the left, second level, as the officer had said, and the angles of the parked vehicles and the structure's concrete pillars created a grid of partial cover that Madeline read as she moved, choosing the path that kept something solid between her and the elevated position, body low, kit close, not running, but not walking either. She found the first officer at the southeast corner of the structure entrance exactly where the perimeter officer had said. He was down on his side behind a concrete barrier post, left hand clamped over his right thigh, and even from 10 feet out she could see the blood pressure in that wound was bad. The dark, fast-spreading stain that meant arterial involvement, the kind of blood loss that doesn't wait for tactical clearance. She came in from his blind side, low, announced herself before she touched him because a wounded officer with his hand on an unholstered weapon needed to hear a voice before he felt contact. Officer. I'm medical. I'm coming to you right now. Don't move your hand. He turned his head. His face was white and sheened with sweat. Where did you? Northgate Medical. I've got you. She was already beside him, already assessing. Her hands went to the thigh. What's your name? Taggart. Marcus. His breathing was fast and shallow. It's bad. It's manageable. Hold still. The entry wound was anterior, mid-thigh. She checked for exit, found it, lateral, which was actually better than no exit because it meant she wasn't chasing a tumbling round. The femoral wasn't fully severed. If it were, he'd have been unconscious before she got here. But it was compromised, and compromised femoral was a clock she could not afford to ignore. She had a tourniquet in her kit. She'd had one for the same reason she'd had the needle decompression, because she'd been in enough situations to know that waiting for the right equipment to arrive was sometimes the same as watching someone die on a schedule. She got the tourniquet on and tightened it past the point where Taggart hissed in pain and grabbed her arm. I know, she said without stopping. I know it hurts. It's supposed to. Keep your hand here on this. Don't touch the mechanism. There's another one. Reyes, she went down further up. I see to you first, then Reyes. Where's the third? Inside the structure. Kowalski, he went in when it started. We couldn't. His grip on her arm tightened. He's been in there for 11 minutes. 11 minutes. In a structure with an active shooter, with no communication, with whatever injuries he'd taken from whatever exchange had put him inside. She finished with Taggart. Wound packed, tourniquet locked, position adjusted to slow the venous return. Not stable. Stable was a word for hospitals. This was managed, which was the best available option. You stay exactly like this, she told him. Don't move the leg. Don't adjust the tourniquet. When EMS comes in, you tell them tourniquet applied, anterior femoral compromise, approximate time. She checked her watch. 9 minutes ago. Can you repeat that? Anterior femoral, tourniquet, 9 minutes. Good. She was already moving. A shot cracked from the second level, close enough that she felt the displaced air, and she dropped behind a concrete pillar on pure reflex and stayed there for 2 seconds while her heart rate did what heart rates do. And then she assessed the angle, decided she was outside the shooter's direct sight line from the position he'd just fired from, and moved again. Formed. Officer Reyes, a woman, mid-30s, dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and concrete dust, was 20 meters further along the structure wall, and she'd made a tourniquet out of her own equipment belt, which told Madeline immediately that she was trained, clear-headed, and had been managing herself for however long she'd been down here alone. The improvised tourniquet was wrong. Not badly wrong. The instinct was right, the location was right, but the tension was insufficient, and the wound beneath it was a forearm laceration that looked worse than it was in terms of immediate threat, but would complicate badly if it wasn't properly controlled. Reyes! The officer's eyes snapped open. She had her weapon up in the same motion. Medical, don't shoot me. Madeline came in low and slow. I'm fixing your arm. Reyes stared at her. How did you get in here? Under the tape. Are you insane? Possibly. She was already adjusting the belt, taking it off, replacing it with the proper tourniquet from her kit. You did good with this. Tension needs to be higher. Reyes made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. Taggart. He's okay. He's managed. She locked the tourniquet. The third one. Kowalski. He's inside the structure? He chased the secondary suspect. We lost radio contact with him almost immediately. Reyes's jaw was tight. Not fear, the kind of controlled tension that comes from training that's holding under pressure. Internal tactical won't go in until they confirm the secondary suspect is contained. That could be another 10 minutes. I know. Madeline looked at the structure entrance. The interior was dim from here, a concrete throat leading into the parking levels. The sounds from the second level had gone intermittent. The shooter was either repositioning or waiting. You're not going in there, Reyes said. How long ago did Kowalski go in? 12 minutes now, maybe 13. Did he take a hit before he went in? Did you see? Reyes hesitated. I thought his left side. I wasn't certain. There was a lot happening. Left side, 12, 13 minutes. If he'd taken a hit on entry, the variables multiplied in ways she didn't love. Don't move this arm, Madeline told her. When EMS arrives, forearm laceration, tourniquet applied, tell them the time. You can't go in there, the shooter is on the second level. Ground floor approach, staying close to the north wall, keeps me outside the likely firing angle. She was looking at the entrance geometry while she said it, not at Reyes. If Kowalski is injured, every additional minute is, I know what every additional minute is. Reyes's voice was sharp. Then quieter. Left side, maybe upper quadrant. That's all I saw. Upper left quadrant. Spleen, descending colon, left lower lung field. The list ran through her head automatically, clinically, the differential assembling itself without effort. I've got it, Madeline said. She looked at Reyes. Stay exactly where you are. She went in. The ground level of the parking structure smelled like oil and concrete, and the particular stale cold of an enclosed space that doesn't get real air circulation. The overhead fluorescents were on their emergency cycle, half of them working, half of them dark, which created an uneven grid of light and shadow that made depth perception unreliable and noise the more useful sense. She moved along the north wall, kit close to her body, listening. The shooter on the second level was moving. She could hear it, footsteps on the concrete above, not running, pacing with the measured quality of someone watching angles. The stairwell at the east end of the structure would take him down if he decided to descend, and she kept half her attention on that stairwell while the other half was on the ground level ahead of her. She found Kowalski behind a parked sedan on the third row. He'd made it 130 feet inside the structure before going down. He was propped against the rear tire of a pickup truck, and he was conscious, which was the first thing that mattered, and his right hand was pressed against his left side below the ribcage, which confirmed what Reyes had seen and told Madeline the rest of the story without him having to say a word. Kowalski. She came in low from the front, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her. His pupils were reactive, which was something. His color was bad. Who are you? Nurse, from Northgate. She was beside him now, pulling his hand away from the wound to assess. He resisted for a second. The protective instinct, the thing where injured people don't want to remove the only pressure they've been able to apply, and she said quietly, "I need to see it. I'll put my hands there. You can put yours back on top of mine." He let her look. The entry wound was low on the left lateral chest, below the last rib, above the iliac crest. A tight, clean hole with the bruising pattern of a close-range round. The exit wound was posterior, and it was larger, which meant the round had moved through soft tissue in a way that could involve the spleen, the left kidney, the descending colon, or some combination of all three. She palpated with 2 fingers, light and systematic. He winced, but didn't make sound. She noted that, filed it as a pain tolerance indicator that was going to make her assessment harder because he'd be underreporting. Belly was slightly rigid, distension beginning, internal bleeding certainly. How much was the question she couldn't fully answer here, in this light, with this equipment? When did this happen? Right when I came in, maybe 12, 14 minutes. She did the math. He was still talking, still tracking her. Pupils were reactive. That bought her something. Not a lot, but something. "The secondary suspect," she said. "Where?" Kowalski pointed. "Further into the structure toward the northwest corner. He went up the west stairwell. Lost him." A pause. "Is he... Has anyone... Tactical is establishing outside. They'll have him." She was packing the wound, working as quietly as she could, hyper-aware of the footsteps still moving above her on level 2. "I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you, and remember it for the paramedics." "Okay." Penetrating abdominal trauma, left lateral, below the costal margin, through and through. Rigid abdomen, early distension, BP is... She put 2 fingers on his wrist, counted. "Low but present. You need a trauma surgeon and you need imaging the second you're out of here. Tell them suspicion of splenic involvement." She met his eyes. "Say it back." He said it back. Slowly, but correctly. "Good." She kept pressure on the wound. "Can you move?" "If I have to." "You're going to have to. Not yet. When I tell you, we're going to move back toward the entrance along this wall. Short movements, low. I'll be beside you the whole time." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just processed that a woman in a nurse's jacket with a field kit has come into an active shooter situation to find him, and is now telling him she's going to walk him out. "You did this voluntarily," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Keep pressure on that wound. A burst of noise from above, so not a gunshot, something falling, something heavy hitting concrete. And then voices, multiple. The clipped, controlled shout of tactical officers moving in coordinated action. The footsteps on level 2 changed pattern suddenly, became faster, became the sound of someone running rather than holding position. Then 2 shots. A beat of silence, then a voice, clear and authoritative, calling out the standard phrase, "Shooter down, second level, confirm secure." Then, almost immediately, "Second suspect in custody, west stairwell, confirm secure." The structure exhaled. That was how it felt. A collective release of pressure, as if the building itself had been holding something and let it go. Madeline kept her hands on Kowalski's wound. "Okay, now we move." Getting Kowalski to the entrance took 4 minutes that felt considerably longer. He was heavier than he looked, and the wound made every movement a negotiation between necessary and too much. And by the time they cleared the structure entrance, the EMS teams were already pushing in past the tape with the particular focused urgency of medical personnel who have been held back past their tolerance and are making up time. The paramedic who reached Kowalski first was a man named Torres, who took in the wound assessment in about 2 seconds and started calling out orders to his partner without breaking stride. Madeline stepped back and let them work, relaying the information she'd already gathered. Wound location, through and through, rigid abdomen, distension, BP estimate, time elapsed. In the compact shorthand of someone who knows exactly which information paramedics need and in which order. Torres glanced at her. "You went in the structure?" "He was in there for 14 minutes. Torres looked at Kowalski, then back at her, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise but was in that neighborhood. He turned back to his patient. He had a job to do, and he did it. Madeline straightened. She became aware, incrementally, of several things at once. The cold. She'd been running warm on adrenaline and was only now registering that her jacket wasn't adequate for standing still in November air. The fact that her hands were covered in blood from two different officers, and she needed to deal with that. The growing density of law enforcement personnel converging on the scene from all directions as the hot zone classification was lifted, and Derek Wolfe standing 20 feet away, staring at her. He'd arrived at some point during the extraction. She hadn't seen him come in, which told her he'd been moving through the scene rather than holding a fixed position, the behavior of a command officer who'd lost control of his scene and was trying to reestablish it. He was in tactical vest over his uniform, radio in hand, and he was staring at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger. Anger she'd seen from him. This was something else, harder to name, a compound thing. The expression of someone encountering information that doesn't fit the category they've built for a person and hasn't yet resolved into a new one. He crossed the distance between them in a few long strides. You went into the hot zone. The hot zone was clear. Tactical called it. She pulled a clean cloth from her kit and started on her hands. Taggart needs a surgical consult on the femoral. Tourniquet is time-stamped approximately 22 minutes ago. I know about Taggart. His voice was different. Still hard, but without the contempt that had been in it every other time he'd spoken to her. You went in before Tactical cleared the scene. Kowalski was in there. Abdominal penetrating trauma, 14 minutes. She met his eyes. He would not have survived another 15. Wolfe stared at her. His jaw worked. You violated. Write it up. She said it the same way she'd said it at the collapse site, flat and without heat. Not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact about how this was going to go regardless. Write it up and add it to the file. My license. My decision. Something in his expression shifted. She couldn't fully read it in the dark and the chaos of the scene, and she didn't have enough information yet to know what the shift meant. She turned away from him to check on Reyes. She didn't see what happened behind her. She didn't see Wolfe stand in place for a full 30 seconds after she walked away, not moving, not speaking into his radio, just standing there with the expression of a man who has organized his understanding of someone around a particular framework and has just watched that framework sustain damage it isn't going to recover from. She didn't see it, but it happened. The three officers reached Northgate in two separate transport vehicles. Madeline arrived back at the hospital 9 minutes after they did, having caught a ride with a patrol unit at Vance's insistence, relayed through a phone call that had contained 3 seconds of silence before Vance said, very quietly, "Are you hurt?" And then, when Madeline said no, "Get back here right now." She went straight to the ER bay. Taggart was already in surgery. Femoral repair, the attending had called it clean and manageable, good tourniquet application, excellent time to intervention. Reyes was in imaging for the arm. Kowalski was being prepped for emergency surgeries. Splenic laceration confirmed on fast ultrasound, surgical team already scrubbing. Madeline stood at the edge of the bay and watched the controlled machinery of the hospital move around the outcomes she'd created, and felt the adrenaline begin its long, ungraceful exit from her system. The shaking that starts in the hands and works up, the sudden awareness of everything her body had been doing for the past 40 minutes without consulting her higher functions, the particular exhaustion that is not tiredness, but is something that sits behind the eyes and weighs more than it should. She was still standing there when she became aware of a different quality of attention entering the room. Not Wolfe, not hospital staff. 2 men in civilian clothes, both of them carrying the specific posture and stillness that she recognized from years of working alongside people trained in the same tradition she'd been trained in. One of them was tall with a gray streak in his hair and a face that was professionally blank in the way only certain people can make a face professionally blank. The other was younger, carrying a bag over one shoulder that was not a hospital bag. They were looking at her. The taller one crossed the room with the unhurried directness of someone who has already decided how this conversation is going to go. "Ms. Hayes," his voice was low. "We've been watching the scene footage from the Callaway response." She said nothing. "We have a situation that's moved past the point of our being able to let it stay informal." He paused. "Your records are about to become very difficult to keep classified." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means Sergeant Wolfe's request to the state licensing board triggered a federal flag 40 minutes ago." He held her eyes. which means the people who are supposed to stay in the background are about to come into the foreground whether we want to or not. The ER bay moved around them, monitors, voices, the sound of medicine happening in every direction. "How many people know?" she asked. "Right now?" He glanced toward the bay entrance. "More than yesterday, fewer than tomorrow." He let that land for a moment. "Captain Hayes, there's a conversation that's going to happen very soon whether you initiate it or it initiates itself. We're here to tell you that the choice of how it starts is still yours. But the window for that choice is..." The doors at the end of the bay opened. Derek Wolfe walked in. He wasn't alone. Behind him was a man in a police department dress uniform that Madeline had never seen at Northgate before. Older, 4 stars on the collar, the bearing of someone who occupied the top of a command structure. And beside the commander, moving with the particular quality of a person who has arrived somewhere they expected to arrive, was Victor Rourke, out of his hospital bed, in street clothes that someone must have brought him, moving carefully, favoring his left side, but moving. He looked at Madeline across the room. Then he looked at the 2 men who were standing with her. His expression confirmed what she already suspected. He knew them, or knew the organization they represented, which was the same thing. Wolfe's eyes moved from her face to the 2 men beside her, and then to Rourke, and she watched the moment when he understood. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. That the woman he had spent the last 36 hours trying to systematically dismantle was not standing here the way he thought she was standing here. She was not standing here alone. The police commander said, "Sergeant Wolfe, I think we all need to sit down." Wolfe looked at Madeline. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. The conference room on the 4th floor of Northgate Medical Center had never been used for anything like this. It was a room built for budget meetings and departmental reviews. A long table, 8 chairs that didn't match each other perfectly, a whiteboard with a ghost of last month's patient flowchart still visible through 3 rounds of erasing. The window looked out over the parking structure. The overhead light had a slight buzz to it that nobody had ever gotten around to fixing. They filled it now. Wolfe, the police commander whose name was Hartwell, 2 men from the organization Madeline had not named and would not name, Victor Rourke in the chair closest to the door, Patricia Vance, who had arrived 2 minutes after everyone else, and had taken the seat at the head of the table with the quiet authority of someone who understood that this was still her building, and Madeline, who sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the middle distance and waited for whatever was going to happen. Raymond Salk, the hospital attorney, had tried to enter the room. One of the 2 men had said something to him quietly at the door, and Salk had stood there for a moment, looked at the assemblage, and left with the expression of a man who understood that whatever liability questions he'd come to address had just been superseded by an entirely different category of situation. Hartwell spoke first. He was the kind of man who'd spent decades in command positions and had developed the particular quality of stillness that comes from never needing to perform authority because it simply was. He set a single folder on the table in front of him, didn't open it. "Sergeant Wolfe, you filed a complaint with the State Nursing Board at 1400 hours today." Wolfe was sitting 2 seats down from Hartwell. He'd come into the room carrying the posture of a man who expected to be the most important person in it, and that posture was undergoing a quiet revision. "I filed a legitimate complaint based on documented violations of..." "You filed a complaint that triggered a federal classification flag within 40 minutes of submission." Hartwell's voice was even. Not angry. Something more effective than angry. Precise. "That flag generated a notification to an office that monitors specific personnel records. That office contacted us. And here we are." Wolfe looked at the 2 men in civilian clothes, then at Madeline. "What office?" Nobody answered him. The taller of the 2 men, the one who'd spoken to Madeline in the ER bay, opened the bag his colleague had carried in and placed a single document wallet on the table. He slid it toward Hartwell without opening it. "Commander, what you need is in there. We'll leave the specifics of the disclosure to your discretion." Hartwell opened the wallet. He spent 90 seconds reading without expression. The room was quiet enough that the buzz of the overhead light was audible. Then he closed it. He looked at Wolfe. He looked at Madeline. "Captain Hayes," he said. The rank landed in the room the way it had landed on the phone line an hour earlier, with weight, with implication, with the particular quality of a word that reframes every other word around it. Wolfe went still. Captain Madeline Hayes, Hartwell continued, served as a senior medical officer attached to a Joint Special Operations Unit for 9 years. Her last 3 years of service involved field medical operations in environments that I am not cleared to discuss in detail, and that are not documented in any file accessible to civilian licensing boards, police departments, or regional hospital administration. He paused. Every procedure she performed in the last 36 hours, including needle decompression in the Harmon collapse site and penetrating wound management in the Callaway active shooter scene, falls within the documented scope of her military medical certification, which remains active under federal registry regardless of her civilian discharge status. The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind that has texture. Wolfe said, "She's a civilian. She's been a civilian for 4 years. Her discharge was administrative. Her certification was retained." The taller civilian spoke for the first time since entering the room. Under the interagency medical personnel framework, a holder of her certification level retains federal authorization for life-threatening field intervention regardless of current civilian employment status. Wolfe looked at Madeline. She looked back at him and said nothing. "Every complaint you filed," Hartwell said, "every incident report, every notification to the licensing board, they're going to be reviewed in light of this documentation. All of them." He folded his hands. "I want to be very clear with you, Derek. I've been in this department for 28 years. I know your record. I also know what that record looks like right now, next to what's in this folder." He touched the wallet. "And it does not look good." Wolfe's jaw was tight. His eyes were moving. Across the table, across the documents, the particular rapid processing of a man whose narrative about a situation is disintegrating and who is calculating what survives. She repeatedly violated scene command authority. She repeatedly saved lives that your scene command was not positioned to save. Hartwell said it without heat, factual. Marcus Taggart is in surgery right now with a repaired femoral artery because she applied a tourniquet inside a hot zone. Daniel Kowalski is in surgery right now with a splenic laceration that would have been fatal in another 20 minutes because she went into an unsecured structure to reach him. 3 firefighters at the Harmon site are uninjured because she identified a structural failure that your incident report doesn't mention. He paused. Your incident report. Something moved across Wolfe's face, the beginning of a reckoning he wasn't ready to complete. "I was doing my job," he said. "You were doing part of your job." Hartwell's voice didn't rise. "The part that involves protecting your authority. The part that involves protecting the people in your jurisdiction. That part had some gaps, and Ms. Hayes," he caught himself, "Captain Hayes filled them." Rourke, who had been silent in his chair by the door, said simply, "She always does." Nobody responded to that. Nobody needed to. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Madeline spoke when spoken to and volunteered nothing. This was not evasion. It was the same economy of engagement she applied to everything, the habit of someone who had learned that the best testimony you can give about yourself is the testimony other people give about you when you're not speaking. Hartwell walked through the formal record methodically. He was the kind of man who understood that the purpose of this meeting was not just to establish facts, but to establish them in a room with witnesses, in language precise enough that it couldn't be misremembered later. He named each incident. He named each outcome. He named each report Wolfe had filed and placed it against the documented medical result of the action the report was criticizing. It was not pleasant. It wasn't meant to be. Wolfe stopped arguing around the 20-minute mark. He went quiet in the particular way of someone who has run out of positions and is now simply waiting for the room to finish with him. He still held his posture. The physical discipline of a career officer didn't evaporate because a meeting was going badly, but the authority had drained out of it, leaving something that looked like the shape of authority without the substance. Patricia Vance spoke twice. The first time to formally withdraw Northgate's compliance inquiry against Madeline, citing the federal certification disclosure. The second time to inform Wolfe, directly and without particular drama, that the hospital would be attaching Dr. Osmond's structural report, the surgical outcomes for all 3 officers, and the full disclosure documentation to its official response to his original complaint, and that this response would be copied to the police department's Internal Affairs Division as a matter of institutional record. Wolfe looked at her when she said it. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had spent 22 years in a building where people died and had very little patience left for people who made others' lives harder for reasons that were primarily about ego. She didn't say that. She didn't need to. When it was over, Hartwell asked everyone except Wolfe to give him a moment with his sergeant. They filed out into the hallway. The two civilians went first, quiet and unhurried. Rourke paused at the door and looked back at the room, at Wolfe, at the folder on the table, at some private calculation Madeline couldn't read, and then left. Vance touched Madeline once on the arm as she passed, a brief contact, nothing performative, and moved down the hallway toward the elevator. Madeline stood in the hallway outside the closed conference room door. She could not hear what Hartwell was saying inside. She wasn't trying to. She stood with her back against the opposite wall and looked at the ceiling and took a slow breath and let it out through her nose and did the thing she'd been doing all her life, which was to feel the full weight of a thing and then set it down before it became something she was carrying permanently. Rourke appeared beside her. He was moving carefully, favoring his left side, one hand braced lightly against the wall. He looked like a man who discharged himself from a hospital bed against medical advice, which was because he was. "You should be lying down," she said. "Probably." He stood beside her and looked at the ceiling with her. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine." "You've been fine all day. That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent light above them was steady, which was better than the one in the conference room. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired of having this be the thing that happens, the having to prove it over and over to people who decided what I was before they looked." She paused. "That's the honest answer." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't get easier." "I know. But it does get documented." He said it with the particular dry quality that she remembered from the shipping container in The Place Without a Name, the way certain people in certain circumstances develop humor as a survival mechanism, not because things are funny, but because the alternative is something less sustainable. "That folder in there, that's not going anywhere." "No," she said. "It's not." The conference room door opened. Hartwell came out alone. He looked at Madeline with the expression of a man who had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. "Wolfe will be in a meeting with Internal Affairs tomorrow morning. The formal review process will take approximately 10 to 14 days, but," he paused, chose his words, "the outcome is not going to be ambiguous." What does that mean for his position? Vance had reappeared from the direction of the elevator, apparently having decided that this hallway conversation also fell within her jurisdiction. "It means his current position is almost certainly temporary." Hartwell said it without satisfaction. The pattern of conduct the documentation establishes, the repeated targeting of Ms. Hayes, the misuse of incident report mechanisms, the failure to credit field outcomes in official records. That's not a single bad day. That's a documented pattern. Internal Affairs is going to see what we see. Madeline said nothing. Hartwell looked at her. "Captain Hayes, I want to say, on behalf of the department, that the outcomes tonight were a direct result of your intervention. 3 officers are alive in a way they might not have been. That's not a small thing." "I know," she said. "It never is." He nodded. He left. She stayed in the hallway until she was sure her legs were going to carry her without drama, and then she went back to the floor because there were still patients and the night wasn't over. And that was the thing about emergency medicine that nobody who hadn't done it fully understood. The emergencies didn't wait for you to finish processing the last one. Well, the next 72 hours happened in layers. The first layer was medical. Taggart came out of surgery at 2 in the morning with a repaired femoral and a prognosis that the surgical team described as excellent, considering. Kowalski's surgery took longer. The splenic laceration had been more complex than the initial imaging suggested, with involvement of a secondary vessel that required another 40 minutes to address. But he was in recovery by 4 a.m., stable, listed as serious but no longer critical. Reyes was discharged the following afternoon with her arm properly repaired and a referral for physical therapy. The second layer was institutional. Northgate's administration formally withdrew every pending compliance action against Madeline by end of business the following day. The letter from Raymond Salk was 3 paragraphs long and used the word clarification 4 times in ways that were clearly doing significant work. Vance handed her a copy in the break room without ceremony. Madeline read it, folded it, and put it in her jacket pocket. "That's it?" Vance said. "What else should it be?" Vance looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you an apology." "You were doing your job." "I was doing my job in a way that assumed his version of events was probably closer to correct than yours. That's not what I should have done." She said it plainly, without excessive apology, which was what made it land as genuine. "I should have trusted what I was watching with my own eyes." Madeline thought about that. "Most people don't," she said. "See what's in front of them, I mean, when it doesn't fit the category they've built." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's just true." Vance made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Get some sleep. You've been on for—" "I know how long I've been on." She went home. She slept. She came back. The third layer was Wolfe. The internal affairs investigation was initiated within 24 hours of the conference room meeting, as Hartwell had indicated it would be. The investigator assigned, a woman named Dara Finch, whom Madeline never met directly, but whose name appeared on every subsequent document, was described by people who knew her as methodical to the point of relentlessness, which in context was not a criticism. The investigation pulled every incident report Wolfe had filed in the last 18 months. It cross-referenced them against the documented outcomes of the events they described. It interviewed Dr. Osman, who gave a clear and precise account of the Harmon site and the structural observation that had preceded the ceiling collapse. It interviewed Lucia Perez, the firefighter who had held the slab, who described what she had seen in the collapse pocket with the directness of someone who'd had time to think about what would have happened if nobody had come in. It interviewed Torres, the paramedic at Callaway, who said simply that in his 12 years of field work, he'd never seen a civilian medical intervention at that level, and that he didn't fully understand how it had happened. Finch also requested the hospital's full record of interactions between Wolfe and Northgate Medical Center over the preceding year. What she found there, sir, the complaint about the domestic call, the Harmon incident report that omitted the ceiling observation, the nursing board notification, assembled into a pattern that laid end to end told a story he hadn't intended to tell about himself. Madeline learned most of this secondhand through Vance, through Rourke, who had been formally discharged from Northgate on day 2, and remained in Ashford at the request of the unnamed organization. She didn't follow it closely. She had patience. She had work. The investigation was happening the way it was supposed to happen, through the channels that were designed for exactly this purpose, and her involvement in it was already concluded. She had given her own statement to Finch on the second day. 45 minutes. She told the investigator what had happened, in what order, and why she had made each decision she had made. She did not editorialize. She did not describe Wolfe in terms that went beyond the documented interactions. She answered every question directly and offered nothing that wasn't asked for. Finch had looked at her at the end of the interview with an expression that was professionally neutral over something more personal. "Is there anything you want to add that I haven't asked about?" Madeline thought about it. "No." "Most people in your position," Finch said, "would have more to say." "Most people in my position haven't done this before." Finch looked at her. "Done what specifically?" "Waited," Madeline said, "for the documentation to do its job." Boy. On the 5th day after Callaway, Taggart asked to see her. He was in a step-down room on the 3rd floor, out of ICU, sitting up in bed with his leg elevated and the particular combination of restlessness and enforced stillness that surgical recovery imposed on people who were accustomed to being physically active. He looked better than he'd looked on the ground outside the parking structure, which wasn't saying much because on the ground outside the parking structure, he'd looked like a man measuring his remaining time in minutes. His wife was in the chair beside him. She was a small woman with alert eyes who had the look of someone who had been awake for most of the past 5 days and intended to stay that way until the situation was resolved to her satisfaction. "You're Hayes," Taggart said when she came in. "I am. Torres told me what happened. The whole thing." He paused. "He said you were in there before the scene was cleared." "The scene was cleared shortly after." "That's not—" He stopped. Tried again. I'm trying to say thank you. I don't know if you want that. My wife says I have to say it anyway. His wife didn't correct this characterization. Madeline stood at the foot of the bed and felt, as she always felt in these moments, the slight awkwardness of being thanked for something that had not, in the moment of doing it, felt like a choice. It had felt like the only available option. It always did. The gratitude of survivors for something that felt to her like inevitability was a gap she'd never fully learned to bridge. You're going to be fine, she said. The repair was clean. You'll need 6 weeks before full weight bearing, but the prognosis is that's not what I'm trying to say. His voice was rougher now, and she understood that he was not a man who talked about things like this comfortably, which made the fact that he was doing it anyway mean something. Wolfe had you on a list, you know that? In his reports, he had you flagged as a repeat protocol violator. I know. He was going to push for your license. He looked at her steadily. I heard what happened in that meeting. Hartwell told me. I just want you to know, Kowalski knows, Reyes knows, we've all talked. If it comes to testimony, if it comes to any of us having to say formally what you did and when, and what it meant, we're there. She looked at him, at his wife, who was watching her with that alert, awake expression. That means something, she said. And she meant it, even though gratitude was a language she was still learning to speak without the distance that had kept her functional for 9 years. She left them. She went back to the floor. She did not think she was the kind of person who let things accumulate into emotion and then have to manage it later. She was wrong about this, slightly. Walking back from Taggart's room, she stopped at the window at the end of the corridor and stood there for a moment and looked at the Ashford skyline, flat and gray and entirely ordinary, and let the weight of the last 5 days do what weight does when you stop moving fast enough to stay ahead of it. 3 people alive who might not have been. A building that hadn't crushed 3 firefighters. 6 years of a buried life suddenly not buried anymore, pulled into fluorescent-lit rooms and documented, named, attached to records that would now exist alongside everything she'd done since she'd left, and tried to be only this, only a nurse, only Madeline, only the woman who stayed on her feet and did the work, and didn't ask anyone to look at what was under the surface. She stood at the window for 4 minutes. Then she went back to work. The formal results of the internal affairs investigation were issued on the 12th day. She wasn't in the room. She didn't ask to be. Rourke called her at 7 in the evening with the summary, reading from what sounded like an official document in the flat tone of someone who has read many official documents and has learned to deliver their content without personal inflection. Derek Wolfe had been formally found in violation of department conduct standards on 3 counts: misuse of official reporting mechanisms, the nursing board notification specifically, filed without evidentiary basis and in a pattern consistent with personal targeting rather than legitimate protocol concern. Failure to document material incident information, the Harmon ceiling observation and its direct relationship to the firefighter repositioning had been deliberately omitted from his official report, which the investigator characterized as a record integrity violation. And conduct unbecoming, a broader finding that covered the documented pattern of harassment, the repeated scene confrontations, and the use of his position to pursue what the investigation characterized as a personal campaign against a civilian medical professional. His command position was suspended pending a departmental review board, which under department guidelines had the authority to recommend permanent demotion or termination. The review board was scheduled for 3 weeks out. He was not arrested. He was not criminally charged. The investigation was internal and administrative, which meant the consequences were real and significant and fell within the category of institutional accountability rather than legal prosecution, and Madeline understood this distinction clearly. She had expected it. The arc of these things rarely extended into criminal proceedings, and she had made peace with that before she had ever walked into the conference room. What mattered was what was documented, what was attached permanently to the official record, what every future context would carry forward. Rourke finished reading. There was a pause on the line. "That's it," he said. "That's the official language." "Okay. You expected that outcome." "More or less." Another pause. "How do you feel about it?" She was in her kitchen again. The same chair, the same table, a different cup of tea. this one hot. She looked at the window, at the dark glass, at the reflection of a woman who looked like a nurse and was also, without contradiction, everything else she'd ever been. I feel like it's enough, she said. I feel like that's going to have to be enough. Is it? She thought about it honestly. Ask me in a month. Rourke made a sound she recognized, not quite agreement, the sound of someone who understood the answer and had decided to respect it rather than push. They want to meet with you, he said. The two from the other night. About the certification situation, the disclosure, what happens now that it's in more people's hands than it used to be. I figured. You want to do it here or here is fine. Northgate. Vance should be in the room. I'll set it up. A pause. Madeline? Yeah? Taggart sent me a message. Through the department liaison channel, which is a very elaborate way of telling a person something. But apparently that's what he did. Rourke's voice was the same as always, dry, measured, and underneath it something more careful. He said he talked to Kowalski and Reyes, and the three of them put something in writing to Hartwell. About you. About what they want the department to formally recognize. She said nothing. She looked at the window. It's not nothing, Rourke said. What they wrote. I know, she said. I know it's not. She hung up. She sat with the hot tea in the quiet kitchen and the dark window for a long time. It was not nothing. She knew that. She'd always known that. The knowing had never been the hard part. The hard part was learning to let it matter without letting it be the reason. Because the moment you started needing the recognition to justify the action, you'd already changed the thing that made the action worth taking. She was still working on that. She suspected she would be working on it for a long time. She was still sitting there, still working on it, when her phone buzzed again. Not Rourke this time. A number she didn't recognize, local Ashford area code, which narrowed it, but she received enough hospital-adjacent calls from numbers she didn't have saved that she didn't immediately flag it as unusual. She picked up. The voice was Derek Wolfe's. She did not speak. She waited. I know you're there, he said. His voice was different from every other time she'd heard it. The certainty had been removed from it, which made it sound almost unfamiliar, like hearing a familiar instrument played in a different key. I'm not going to threaten you. I want you to understand that. I'm not... He stopped, started again. I'm calling because I needed to say something that I couldn't say in a room with my commander and your people and all of that. She waited. I looked at the outcomes, he said. The medical outcomes, the 3 officers, the firefighters, the 2 workers from the Harmon site. A pause that had weight in it. I looked at all of it and I tried to find the version of events where what I did made sense, and I can't make that version hold together anymore. She said nothing. I thought you were a problem. I thought you were someone who didn't respect authority, didn't respect the system, thought the rules didn't apply to her. His voice was rough. I built that picture of you, and I kept adding to it every time you... He stopped again. I was wrong about what I was seeing, and people almost died because of that. Kowalski, Taggart. The roughness in his voice had shifted into something harder to categorize. I don't know if that's something you can accept an apology for. I don't know if I'd accept it in your position. The kitchen was very quiet. Madeline looked at the window, at her own reflection. She thought about Taggart on the ground outside the parking structure, white-faced and holding his own leg. She thought about Kowalski propped against the tire of a pickup truck in the dark, with his hand on his side. She thought about 6 years of deliberate quiet, of a life built precisely around the principle that the work was the justification and didn't need anyone's validation to be real. She thought about what it cost a man like Derek Wolfe to make a phone call like this. I hear you, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was the only accurate thing she had to say, that she had received what he'd said and it had registered, and she was not going to perform either resentment or grace at him in the dark of her kitchen at 10 p.m. A long silence. Okay, he said. He hung up. She put the phone down on the table, picked up the tea, drank it. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed a 3rd time, and this time when she looked at the screen, the message was from an address she recognized. The internal hospital system, nursing administration, a routine-looking sender. And the subject line read simply, Request, Review of Proposed Program, Joint Tactical Medical Response. She opened it. The email was from Hartwell, copied to Vance, to the hospital's CMO, to two names she didn't recognize that looked like city administration. It was brief, formal, and it contained a proposal that the Ashford Police Department, in conjunction with Northgate Medical Center, develop a joint training program for tactical emergency medical response, to close the gap that the Callaway incident had made visible between what first responders could do in a hot zone and what medical personnel were authorized to enter. And at the bottom, in language that was carefully official but unmistakable in what it was actually saying, it named her. This proposal is contingent on the participation of Ms. Madeline Hayes as primary program architect and lead instructor, given her documented expertise in both field medicine and tactical operations. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the table. She looked at the dark window for a long time, at the woman in the glass who had spent 4 years being only a nurse, which had been a choice and a refuge and a form of protection she'd built around something that apparently could not stay protected indefinitely. The proposal was on the table. The documentation was in the folder. The investigation was concluded. The 3 officers were alive. She needed to give Hartwell an answer. She looked at the phone. She looked at the window. She did not pick the phone up yet, because the moment she did, the shape of her life in Ashford was going to change in a direction she hadn't planned for, and she was someone who understood the value of the pause before irreversible decisions, the moment of stillness before the weight of a thing shifted from possible to real. She sat in it. Outside, Ashford was quiet. 4 blocks away, the intersection of Callaway and 9th was clean and empty, the police tape gone, the structure open again, the ordinary traffic of an ordinary city moving through a place where something extraordinary had happened and been absorbed back into the unremarkable texture of Tuesday evening. She breathed. She reached for the phone, and it rang before she touched it. Not the Northgate system, not Rourke, not Hartwell, but the unknown federal number from 2 nights ago. And when she picked it up, the voice on the other end said, before she could speak, Captain Hayes, there's something you need to know before you respond to that email. She didn't say anything for a moment, just held the phone and let the voice on the other end fill the silence of her kitchen with something that was going to change the shape of the next hour. What do I need to know? She said. The man on the federal line, the taller one, the one with the gray streak, whose name she still didn't have and hadn't asked for, spoke with the particular economy of someone delivering a briefing, not a conversation. The Department Review Board for Wolfe, it's been moved up. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Hartwell pushed for acceleration because 3 of the affected officers formally requested it, which means whatever you decide about the email tonight, you should know that by tomorrow afternoon, the departmental outcome is going to be public record. Public record. The department is not going to be able to contain the scope of it. The investigation findings, the outcomes, the incidents. It's going to be reported. Local news has already been making inquiries. A pause. We can't manage the classification around your background the way we could have if this had stayed internal. Once it goes into reporting, your name is in it. We wanted you to know that before it happened, rather than after. She processed this. The kitchen was quiet around her. The tea was cold again. Is there anything in my record that can't be in a news report? She asked. The operational specifics, yes. The deployment locations, the unit designations, the mission parameters, none of that surfaces. What surfaces is the certification, the service history at the broad level, and the events of the last 2 weeks. And my name. And your name. She had spent 4 years in Ashford being nobody's story, being the quiet nurse who stayed on her feet and did her work, and didn't ask the city to know anything about her. She had built that life with intention, and she had lived in it with something close to peace, and she understood in this moment that it was over. Not the life itself, but the particular invisible quality of it that she had valued more than she'd admitted to herself. Okay, she said. That's it? What else should it be? A short silence. Most people need more time with that. I had the time while you were talking. She looked at the window. Is there anything else? The email from Hartwell. Whatever you decide, we think you should know that it has support at levels above his pay grade. The Callaway incident created a gap in the official framework for how medical personnel interface with tactical situations, and there are people who want that gap closed systematically. Your name came up before Hartwell's email did. She absorbed this. How long has my name been coming up? Longer than the last 2 weeks. She didn't ask what that meant in precise terms. She understood enough of how these things worked to know that the answer would be both true and incomplete, and that complete answers in that direction required clearances she no longer carried. I'll respond to Hartwell tomorrow, she said, after the board. Copy that. The line went quiet for a moment before he disconnected, and she had the impression, unverifiable but persistent, that whatever the unnamed organization was, it was pleased with how this had resolved, and that its pleasure was not entirely coincidental to the way events had unfolded. She put the phone down. She looked at the window one last time, then she washed her cup, went to bed, and slept. The Departmental Review Board convened at 8 a.m. in the Ashford Police Department's fourth-floor hearing room, which Madeline had never been inside. She wasn't required to attend. She wasn't invited to attend. She went anyway, arriving at 7:50 and sitting in the public gallery with the quietness of someone who has learned to occupy space without announcing it. The room filled. Officers she recognized from Callaway, faces she'd seen in the ER over the last 2 weeks. Hartwell at the front, a 3-person board at the elevated table, a deputy commissioner, a senior internal affairs officer, and a civilian representative from the city's Public Safety Oversight Committee. Wolfe came in last. He was in dress uniform, which was procedure, and he sat in the chair designated for the subject of the review, with a posture that still carried the physical discipline of his career, even though the authority had been leaching out of it for 12 days. He did not look toward the public gallery. She did not need him to. The proceeding was formal and moved with the particular efficiency of institutions that have done a thing many times and know exactly how long each component takes. The investigating officer, not Finch herself, but a representative presenting her findings, walked through the 3 violations in order. The misuse of reporting mechanisms, the omission of material incident information, the conduct pattern. For each count, documentation was entered into the record. The nursing board notification and its triggering of a federal flag. The harm on incident report set against Dr. Osmond's concurrent report and the structural outcome. The domestic call complaint against the record of the cardiac patient's survival and subsequent cath lab intervention. The Callaway incident reports against the surgical outcomes for all 3 officers. Laid end-to-end in the flat language of official findings, it was a thorough account of what happened when a person with institutional power decides that his version of a situation is correct before he has looked at the situation and then uses that power to enforce his version against the evidence. Wolfe was given the opportunity to respond. He spoke for 4 minutes. He did not deny the findings. He did not construct alternative explanations. He said, in language that was more direct than Madeline had expected from a man in his position at a proceeding like this, that he had made a series of decisions driven by assumptions he had not examined, and that the outcomes of those decisions were his responsibility, and that he understood the board's authority in this matter and would accept its determination. It was not a performance of contrition. She could tell the difference. It was the statement of a man who had sat with the documentation for 12 days and arrived at a place where denial was no longer structurally possible, and who had enough integrity left under the damage to say so in public. The board deliberated for 22 minutes. The determination was formal demotion from sergeant to officer, a 60-day suspension without pay, mandatory completion of a conduct review program, and a 2-year probationary period during which any further conduct violations would result in termination. His formal commendation record, which was real, and which the board acknowledged was real, was noted but did not alter the outcome. The board's written findings stated explicitly that a pattern of targeted conduct against a civilian medical professional, combined with deliberate omission of material information from official records, constituted a fundamental breach of the public trust that a command position required. The gavel came down. Madeline sat in the gallery and did not feel what she'd expected to feel, which she'd thought would be satisfaction. What she felt instead was something quieter and less dramatic. The particular settling that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time is corrected, not with fanfare, but with paperwork and formal language and a gavel, which is usually how correction actually happens when it happens at all. She left before the room finished clearing. Git. She called Hartwell from the parking lot. "I'll do the program," she said when he picked up. "But I have conditions." "Tell me." "It's not a police training program with a medical component. It's a joint program. Equal authority. Firefighters, EMS, hospital staff, police, everyone in the same room, everyone subject to the same curriculum." She leaned against her car. The morning was cold and flat and ordinary. The whole point is that the gaps exist because these groups don't train together. If this program just teaches cops how to tolerate a medic in their space, it solves the wrong problem. Agreed. I want Vance as institutional co-lead on the hospital side. I'll ask her. She'll say yes. She's been waiting for something like this for a decade. She just doesn't know it yet. A pause. And I want Rourke as tactical consultant. His clearance is current. His field experience covers the gaps in what I can formally document. Rourke is... Hartwell paused. He's not a city employee. He doesn't need to be. Consultant contract. He's already in Ashford. Another pause. He told me last night he's not in any particular hurry to leave. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. She could hear him processing, not resisting, just assembling. Timeline? I want to be running the first cohort in 90 days. That's enough time to build the curriculum, but not enough time for the bureaucracy to redesign it into something that doesn't work. That's aggressive. The gap is open right now. In 3 months, it'll still be open. In a year, people will have adjusted to the gap and started treating it as normal. She looked at the flat Ashford sky. 90 days. Hartwell made a sound that she read as reluctant agreement with someone whose logic he couldn't successfully argue against. I'll bring it to the CMO and the city liaison today. Good. She pushed off from the car. One more thing. What? The program doesn't carry my name. It doesn't get named after anyone. It's a city resource, not a monument to a situation. She said it without edge, just clearly. The whole point is that it outlasts any individual person, including me. A pause. You know the city is going to want to recognize you publicly. The 3 officers, the outcomes. It's going to come out in the reporting, and I know. I'm not asking for anonymity. I'm asking for proportion. She opened her car door. There's a difference between letting people know what happened and making it about a single person. I want the program to be the story, not me. Hartwell was quiet for a moment longer than usual. You're an unusual person, Captain Hayes. Just Hayes, she said. I've been Hayes for 4 years. It still fits. She hung up. She got in the car. She sat for a moment with the engine off, in the parking lot of the Ashford Police Department on a cold morning, and let the last 2 weeks settle into their final shape. 3 officers alive. 2 construction workers who'd gone home to people who hadn't been prepared to lose them. 3 firefighters who'd moved away from a ceiling section without knowing exactly why, because someone had looked at a fracture line and understood what it meant. A man named Victor Rourke, upright and moving around Ashford with a healing orbital fracture, and the slightly amused patience of someone watching an inevitability resolve itself. A program that didn't exist yet, but would exist in 90 days. And Derek Wolfe, in a hearing room 1 floor up, processing the formal consequences of having decided what someone was before he looked at them. She started the car. She drove to Northgate. But the local news ran the story 4 days later. It was not a small story. The Callaway active shooter incident had already been covered, but the follow-up, the identity of the nurse who had entered the hot zone, the internal affairs findings, the federal certification disclosure, the construction site interventions, that was a different story, with more layers, and the reporter who'd gotten the documents was good at her job and had clearly understood which thread to pull. Madeline read it on her phone in the break room during a 15-minute gap between patients. The headline was more restrained than she'd expected. The piece was accurate, which was what mattered. It named her. It named the 3 officers by name. It named Wolfe by name. And described the board's findings without embellishment and without mercy. It described the Harmon collapse and the domestic call and the pattern of complaints. It described the federal certification and what it meant in plain language. It did not describe her as a hero. It described what she had done and what had resulted from it, and let those facts carry the weight, which was exactly right. And she made a note to find out who the reporter was so she could acknowledge, if it ever came up, that the person had done their job well. Kowalski called her that afternoon from his recovery room. He'd been moved to a standard floor, which meant the surgical team was happy with his progress. "You read it?" he asked. "I read it. How do you feel?" "Like I need to finish my shift." A pause. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone took a piece of my spleen, which is accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "The program Hartwell mentioned, the joint training thing. It's happening. I want to be in the first cohort, when I'm cleared for full duty." His voice had the directness of someone who had spent time in a hospital bed thinking about what he wanted to do differently when he got out. "I want to understand what you did in there, how you made those calls. I want my people to know how to do that." She thought about what it meant that a man who'd been bleeding in the dark of a parking structure for 14 minutes was now, 5 days out of major surgery, thinking about training programs. "You'll be in it," she said. "Tell Taggart and Reyes the same offer stands." She went back to her patients. Vance said yes to the co-lead, which Madeline had known she would. She said it in the particular way Vance did things, without excessive enthusiasm, without performing reluctance, just a direct acknowledgement that this was the right thing and she was going to do it. She also, in the same conversation, handed Madeline a printed copy of a formal commendation from Northgate's board of directors, acknowledging her actions during both the Harmon collapse and the Callaway incident. Madeline looked at it, folded it, put it in her pocket next to the compliance withdrawal letter from Salk, which she still hadn't done anything with because she hadn't yet decided what you do with documentation of a wrong that's been corrected, whether you keep it as record or let it go as weight. "You're not going to frame it," Vance said. "I might." Vance looked at her with the expression she'd been using for 22 years on people who underestimated themselves. "You should." Rourke agreed to the consulting role via text message. 3 words. "Obviously." "When do we start?" She replied with the 90-day timeline, and he replied with a single number, 88, which he understood to mean he thought he could have the tactical curriculum component ready in 88 days if she stopped messaging him and let him work. She stopped messaging him and let him work. The first cohort assembled on a Tuesday morning. Because it was always a Tuesday, she had apparently accepted this about her life in Ashford, in the training facility 2 blocks from Northgate that the city had allocated for the program. 22 people in the room, 8 police officers including Taggart, who'd been cleared for light duty at week 10 and had signed up the day clearance came through. 4 firefighters, including Lucha Perez, who had held a concrete slab in place and then watched a woman she'd never met crawl under it, and who had arrived 15 minutes early. 6 paramedics and EMS personnel, 4 hospital nurses, and Dr. Osman, who had signed up because Madeline had asked him personally and because he was, underneath the shaken residency physician who'd been rattled by his first field call in 4 years, someone who understood that the right response to being rattled was to get better. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them. 22 people, different uniforms, different training backgrounds, different institutional reflexes and default assumptions about whose authority meant what when multiple agencies were in the same space. Every single gap that had almost gotten someone killed in the last 3 months was represented somewhere in that room. "Here's the problem we're solving," she said. "When something happens, a collapse, a shooting, a mass casualty event, everyone in this room responds, and everyone in this room has training, and everyone's training was built inside a silo." She paused. A cop's training tells him the medic is a liability in a hot zone. A medic's training tells her the hot zone is the cop's problem until it's cleared. And in the gap between those 2 positions, people bleed. The room was quiet. "We're going to close that gap, not by arguing about whose protocol is right, by learning each other's protocols well enough that we can make real decisions in real situations instead of defaulting to rules that were written for conditions that don't exist when things actually go wrong." She looked across the room, at Perez, at Taggart, at Osman, at 22 people who had each, in their own way, already lived the gap. This isn't about hierarchy. It's about what actually keeps people alive. Nobody argued with her. She hadn't expected them to. But there was a version of the world in which they might have, and the fact that they didn't, that 22 people in different uniforms sat in a room and listened to a nurse explain what she was going to teach them and accepted it without the performance of institutional resistance, told her something about what the last 3 months had done to the way this city understood her. They had looked, finally, and they had seen. Wolfe came back to the department after his suspension on a cold morning in late winter, in the uniform of an officer rather than a sergeant, and the city moved on around it the way cities do, registering the change briefly and then absorbing it back into the texture of ordinary days. She did not see him return. She was in the training facility when it happened, running the second cohort's first session, and she learned about it through a brief message from Hartwell that said only, "Wolfe returned to duty today. Officer grade. Thought you should know." She read it, acknowledged it, went back to the session. She did not feel charitable about what had happened to Wolfe. She was not the kind of person who arrived at forgiveness on schedule or performed it for the benefit of a narrative. What she felt, honestly, was the complicated residue of a situation that had never been simple. A man who had been wrong in ways that had real consequences, who had been held accountable in ways that were real and proportional, and who was now carrying that accountability forward into whatever kind of officer he was going to be for the rest of his career. Whether that made him better or just smaller, she didn't know. She wasn't in a position to know. She could only speak to her own accounting, which was this. She had done her work. She had been who she was without apology or performance, and she was still here, still on her feet. Still, when the radio crackled and the alert came in and the ER bay filled with the organized chaos of people who needed help they couldn't provide for themselves, the first one through the door. Not because of rank, not because of certification or federal documentation or a folder in a conference room, because she was the one who knew what to do, and she had always been the one who knew what to do, and the only thing that had changed was that now, when she moved toward the crisis and the other people in the room processed what they were seeing, nobody stepped in front of her. They stepped aside, not out of deference, out of recognition. There's a version of this story that ends with a ceremony, a plaque, a formal presentation. The city gathered to acknowledge what one person did. That version is satisfying in a particular way, and it is not wrong to want it, because recognition matters, and the instinct to mark courage publicly is a decent instinct. But the version that is true is this. The emergency call came in at 9:47 on an unremarkable evening, and Madeline Hayes was already moving before the announcement finished, already assembling the information she needed in the shorthand of someone for whom emergency was not an interruption of life, but the condition under which she was most fully herself. And every person in that ER, the nurses who'd watched her work for 4 years, the doctors who'd adjusted to her precision, the paramedics who'd learned to brief her differently than anyone else, the police officers who'd come through those doors after Callaway, every one of them moved with her instead of in front of her, because they finally knew. They'd always been surrounded by someone extraordinary. They just had to stop assuming they knew what extraordinary looked like before they found it. That is the thing about quiet people, the ones who do not argue when they are dismissed, who do not perform their capability before it's needed, who carry what they carry without asking anyone to acknowledge the weight. They're very easy to mistake for something smaller than they are. The mistake is never theirs. It belongs to the people doing the looking, and the cost of it falls on everyone in the room. Madeline Hayes had been there all along. She was still there now. She always would be.